Hello, Internet Wrestling Community. Hello, IWC. How are you? My name is Anthony, and I am the greatest wrestling shooter unknown to YouTube. Coming to you live on your internet servers. Welcome to Wrestling's Real Talk 101, where real issues get discussed in the world of professional wrestling. Now, since I'm new to this whole thing, I figure I start off with a great introduction, right? That's great. And I know every fan has their own stories of how they became a wrestling fan, and it's totally epic for them. For them. But my story is totally epic in the sense that it is amazing. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean my story is great. My story of how I became a wrestling fan is one that I hope will be talked about for years and ages on end. Rather than reading off a script, I want to share with you a story of how I became a wrestling fan. It was one Saturday afternoon in October. I was watching cartoons at my grandfather's house. I can't remember what I was watching. I think if I was to look back and remember what I was watching, I think the only thing that I was allowed to watch at that point, at my young age of 7, was probably Bugs Bunny and Tweety. And I think Bugs Bunny and Tweety were getting boring at this point because it's basically the same thing over and over. Sylvester tries to get the Tweety, and Tweety outsmarts him every time. So you can see how boring it would get. So I went channel surfing, and I didn't see anything I liked. That was until I turned into WWE, or at the time, WWF Saturday Superstars. Now, for those old timers who knows what Saturday Superstars are, that's great. It was a show around noon that displayed wrestling for an hour, and it was a great hour of television and great entertainment to go along with it. Now, as I said, I tuned into WWE Superstars to watch for that hour, and I would see the infamous Jake the Snake Randy Savage snake bite for the very first time. I was totally shocked because I'd never seen anything like that on TV before. So I asked my grandfather, who was cooking in the other room at this point, what was I watching on TV. He came in the other room and noticed how hesitant I was when asking him what I was watching. So he rushed in the other room, looked at the television, sat down beside me, shook his head, then turned off the TV. Then he spoke to me, saying, "Anthony, what you just saw on TV was crap. The wrestlers that you had just seen, they're acting." I didn't know what he meant, so he told me a story. He said, "When your mother and your uncles were your age, I took them to a wrestling show. The wrestling show featured Tony Garea and Bruno Sammartino. It was at the Stratford Coliseum. Bruno Sammartino was a legend within wrestling, alongside with Tony Garea. He explained to me how he lost his faith in professional wrestling. He had said that at the live show, he had saw Sammartino pull his punches. For those of you who don't understand what pulling punches are, it's to make an action of punching your opponent but not actually connecting with the shot. So just the vibrating sound and maybe a little slap. And thus he told me that's when he lost his faith in professional wrestling. And he says wrestling back then wasn't how it is today with the garbage you see. Wrestling back then was the true meaning of the word sport. I honestly think Bruno Sammartino and Tony Garea were my grandfather's favorites because they were Italian, just like us. So, like a good like a good intuitive son, I went home and I explained what my grandfather had said. I explained all this to my mother, and my mother had confirmed every word that my grandfather had said to me was true. So, where does that leave me? Well, the next day, it was Tuesday afternoon, around 4 o'clock. Now, here in Canada, I usually watch SportsCenter at 4 o'clock. It's like a ritual for me. You come home, you watch sports. You eat supper. After you eat supper, you watch sports. You get up in the morning, you watch sports. Yes, there's a lot of sporting going on. So, that was my after school ritual. I would come home from school, I would watch TV, and watch the SportsCenter highlights. At that time, I was a big Toronto Maple Leafs fan. Not so much anymore, I think they suck. But that's just my opinion. It's my show, so I can have those opinions. But I never used to think they used to suck. But, back to the story. As I was getting geared up to watch TSN SportsCenter, I noticed something different. SportsCenter highlights weren't on. But what I did see was an episode of Monday Night Raw. I guess it must have been the replay, correct? Because I remember a time where wrestling used to be previewed on Tuesdays at 4 p.m. This was before I was privy to the whole situation, and it was featured on TSN. Now, I didn't know what to make of the things I saw on TV. Now, because I was interested in storytelling from previous The Snake Bite, I decided to keep watching. My mother came in the living room and said, "You can watch your wrestling show for now, but when your father gets home, you better turn that crap off." Honestly, he said that. Now, I honestly believe that my father despised wrestling. And I think the reason he despised wrestling is because of the fact that he wanted me to admire him rather than the wrestlers on the screen, like Hulk Hogan. But I couldn't help it. I gravitated towards Hulk Hogan. His right and wrong, his protein, his eating the vitamins, saying the prayers of his genius. Millions of fans couldn't help but gravitate towards him. It just wasn't me. But as the years went on, my interest in wrestling grew. It grew so immensely that at the age of 12, it gave way to the PG programming era that would only grow more intense for me. In 1996 through 2001, Stone Cold, The Rock, Triple H, Shawn Michaels were the go-to main event for household names that would eventually be essential to the Attitude Era of wrestling. The Attitude Era of wrestling would see blood, Hell in the Cell, hardcore, no disqualification matches. The wrestling was in your face. I shuddered to think what my dear grandfather would have thought if he would have seen the Attitude Era in wrestling. Violence and sexuality were what made the era so popular. A lot of fans seem to think that the mid-90s were the golden age of wrestling. Because of the excessive violence, the fans began to have assumptions that this kind of wrestling was freaking awesome. Wrestling in the 90s gave birth to the real side of entertainment. To wrestling, present though, blood and sexuality did not belong in wrestling. In other words, some people who watched wrestling early in their lives did not agree with what WWE promoted. My father refers to wrestling as crap, plain and simple. My mother had said to me once, if I would apply as much as I do in wrestling to school, then I would be a freaking genius. The demographics for wrestling in the mid-90s were different from the 80s. And in the 80s, you had wrestlers like Hulk Hogan promoting positive messages of training and eating your vitamins and saying your prayers. In the mid-90s, you had D-Generation X having 2 words for you. Also, Austin's constant finger gesturing of the boss of the WWF. The mid-90s were definitely not your grandfather's kind of wrestling. Here's the great entertainment, good storytelling, and even better wrestling. Now, that is the true story of how I became a wrestling fan. In that order, too. Now, before I shut this post off, I just want to mention a few things to give people a bunch of props. I want to give NoDQ.com a lot of props because they know their wrestling and they have great shows. So if you're a fan of wrestling, I encourage you to check out NoDQ.com. Also, if you're a fan of wrestling talk, then I encourage you to check out Right After Wrestling, only on The Score. Yes, I'm that geeky about wrestling shows, but whatever. I gave you a plug, Art. I'd be happy. Yeah. So if you're a fan of wrestling talk and discussions, check out Right After Wrestling, featured on The Score at 6 p.m. on Mondays and 10 p.m. on Friday nights. And honestly, that show is so good, I think it should be an hour instead of half an hour. Also, I want to give a plug to, let's see, the Bleacher Report, because they have great stories of information, and they're vessels of information. I also want to give a plug to some good shooters out there. Spinner 1 and rotisserie Jamie Loves Taker. Jeff Meacham, obviously, because he's the man. He is the man. He is the reason I do what I do. Let's see. Let's see. Who do I have to say? I think that about wraps it up. Oh, the WWE review guys. They are some great people. Check out the WWE review guys. They're hilarious. They get right to the point. For all the other shooters, don't check them out because they're not me. So they can't carry a candlestick. Oh, and one more plug. Check out ringrap.com. Yes, Drew, I gave you a plug because ringrap.com is sometimes where wrestling information can be found. Now, for the IWC, I am Anthony. Here's to good storytelling, great entertainment, and even better wrestling. Sayonara.